Okay, good evening. My name is Matthew Whitman, and I'm the curator of the Harvard Theater Collection. I'm coming to you live tonight from a very windy Somerville, Massachusetts, where there is a toddler struggling her way towards bed, so apologies if there's a bit of background noise as I go through this introduction. In any case, thank you for joining us for Final Bow for Yellowface, Asian Representation in Classical Ballet and Beyond, with Georgina Pascogan, Phil Chan, and Julian Kim. Before proceeding, I just want to note that this talk will be recorded and made available online in the days after the event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the virtual Houghton Library. As some of you will know, the library began undergoing a renovation in 2019, one which is now largely complete. And so for those of you that are joining us locally, we hope to see you at our new library at some point in 2020. Of course, one of the opportunities born of the present crisis has been a turn to presenting events online for an audience beyond the confines of the Harvard campus. So a special welcome to those of you that are joining us from all over the world. We felt it would be appropriate to hold this event in December as the annual ballet fever known as the Nutcracker takes hold, as it was the racial caricatures associated with this holiday tradition that spurred Georgina and Phil into action. And while we will hear more about that shortly, I want to take the opportunity to say a few words about why the Harvard Theater Collection is hosting this event today. First off, our name is something of a misnomer in so much as the collection extends well beyond the theatrical stage and includes a significant amount of material relating to the history of dance and of the ballet in particular. This includes everything from an enormous collection of antiquarian dance books and prints to a world-class collection of the Ballet Russe and the archives of luminaries like George Balanchine and Michel Fokine. Houghton Library also holds singular treasures like the Sergeyev dance notations, which document the performance of Marius Petipa's ballets at the Mariinsky Theater in the early 20th century, including, of course, the Nutcracker. I know Phil will be making use of a few things from the collection in his remarks tonight. This is just to say to an audience that might be unfamiliar with the library that there is much, much more. Finally, one of my goals at the library has been to see that we do a better job of collecting and reflecting the diversity of American life moving forward. Despite our somewhat different endeavors, it has been inspiring to hear Georgina and Phil talk so eloquently and hopefully about their passion for the ballet and how embracing diversity promises a way forward for the cultural form. As to the program for this evening, I'm going to introduce all of our speakers at the top so as to keep things moving. During the first part, we will be hearing a presentation from Phil and Gina about their ongoing work with the Final Bow for Yellowface project. After that, Professor Julian Kim will offer a short comment that will also signal a transition to the second part of the program, which will more resemble a panel discussion. To aid in that, I have a few questions that were submitted by you all in advance. And then of course, we will also have the ability to take live questions via Zoom as they come up in the course of the evening. You will note that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so please type your questions there. And if you see something already asked that you also want addressed, there is a means for you to upvote other people's questions. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in the order that they will appear. First up is Phil Chan. Apologies. Phil Chan most recently served as the Director of Programming for Ivy, connecting young professionals with leading American museums and performing arts institutions. He is a graduate of Carleton College, an alumnus of the Ailey School. And to learn much more about how he ended up pursuing the mix of art, activism, scholarship that animates the Final Bow for Yellowface project, I encourage you to check out his book, Final Bow for Yellowface, Dancing Between Intention and Impact. Georgina Pascogan is a soloist with the New York City Ballet and a co-founder of Final Bow for Yellowface. Born in Altoona, Pennsylvania, Gina trained with the Allegheny Ballet Academy before entering the School of American Ballet, joining the Corps de Ballet of the NYCB in 2003. She has a long list of credits beyond the ballet, having appeared on Broadway in Cats and On the Town, and in film and television, most recently in the miniseries Fosse Vernon. For those of you, you can see her dance in the Nutcracker as Coffee on Marquee TV at the moment, and then also in the digital fall season available from the New York City Ballet. Finally, Julian Kim is professor of English at Harvard University. Her work focuses on Asian American literature, theater, and performance studies. She is the author of The Racial Mundane, Asian American Performance and the Embodied Everyday, and she is currently working on a manuscript titled Paper Performance, suspicion, and the spaces of Asian American theater. I'll just say briefly that Juan also has a toddler about, so if she has to step away for a moment, um, I would think we can all understand. So thanks to you all for participating tonight. And with that, I will turn the virtual floor over to Phil Chan.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for having us, Matt. So my name is Phil Chan. We are final bow for Yellowface. Wanted to share sort of a story of how we kind of got started. Gina was in a diversity committee meeting at New York City Ballet. The topic of the Nutcracker came up, and then artistic director Peter Martins mentioned that the company had received a lot of letters about the Chinese variation and George Balanchine's Nutcracker. And on one hand, he felt like he couldn't make any changes to Balanchine's legacy. It wasn't his place to do that. But also he couldn't ignore just society was changing, and you know, the people we wanted in the audience, people of color, were not responding well to this sort of outdated view of different cultures. So he invited me into his office. This was about 3 years ago to discuss the dance. And we came out of that meeting talking about the costuming, the makeup, and the choreography. And we also talked a lot about the history of how Asians have been represented in classical ballet. So those two things in mind, he made a lot of changes, little changes to Balanchine's Nutcracker, but that spurred a whole lot of changes around the country with, you know, at this point, every major American ballet company has signed our pledge at yellowface.org. And now the conversation is starting to spread to Europe. I know Paris Opera and Royal Danish Ballet are having this conversation right now. So it's really wonderful to see our art form changing slowly and becoming more inclusive. So wanted to share with you a little bit of the history that Peter and I talked about. And then Gina will talk a little bit about her experience as a dancer in New York City Ballet around this production as well. So I know this is sort of an unusual place to start, but wanted to introduce you to, many of you probably know Genghis Khan. He's the man here on the left. He was a brutal, ruler of the Mongols, but he was probably the first diversity warrior as we know it. So he did all sorts of brutal things. I think he killed about 40 million people, some historians estimate, which was like 11% of the world's population. So like brutal guy. But he did a few things that would change the course of how Asians were represented in Europe. First of all, see that whole area on the right, he unified that whole region under his control. So as a result of that, the exchange of ideas, goods, people became much easier. And so also when he conquered a new place, in order to keep local populations from uprising, he would spread those people out across his empire. So again, you have different religions, different languages, science, medicine, all starting to mix in these different societies at a much faster rate. And as a result of the safe travel across his empire, suddenly Europeans were getting access to Asian goods. And so the earliest depictions of Asians were two-dimensional. They came on, to quote Gilbert and Sullivan, on many a vase and jar, on many a screen and fan. And that also captivated the Europeans' attention. So especially in France, here we have a painting by Francois Boucher, which depicts a Europeanized version of what they would have seen on two-dimensional objects to show Chinese-ness. And there was this sort of loop where choreographers were inspired by the objects, and then Boucher would paint the choreography as if it were authentic. And so it had this sort of reinforcing effect. So with the ballet La Fête Chinoise in 1751, it sort of, Boucher did the sets and then also painted paintings of the ballet itself. So again, this sort of made up, based on two-dimensional version of Asian-ness. Then of course we see something a little bit more familiar. This, for those of you who followed Ratmansky's reconstruction of the Sleeping Beauty, we have these porcelain princesses from 1921. They actually date, these designs actually date much further back. They actually come from Rameau's opera ballet Les Indes Galantes, which is from 1735. And so here we have the same design that inspired Bakst and then now again revived at ABT in 2010. So the actual designs are 300 years old. So there was also in France, especially at this time, and again, please excuse this very simplified history. This is just to give very basic context to where we are today. We see a rise of Orientalism paired with this idea of Romanticism in the 18th century, especially in France. So we see things like Lord Byron's poem and literature inspiring ballets like Le Corsaire, and this photo is from the Harvard's collection here on the left. We also have stories of India coming back to us from the press, where this new colony and Queen Victoria is crowned the Empress of India, and there's all this intrigue, and especially at a time when Europe was not really a very colorful place. It was industrializing, so there was smoggy air, morality was slipping, morale was low, and so being able to have this imagined Orient, which was a place of nature, of sexuality, of magic, of drugs, it was that was a really attractive part of the interest of ballet for many years. And then when we started to see this influx of Asians actually coming into Western or American spaces, we start to see the rise of caricature. So here's an image from Harper's Weekly in 1869. It's the cartoon is Pacific Chivalry. So here we have the Q on the immigrant worker who is, I assume, coming from China to find gold. And so we see this influx of Chinese immigrants who were not rich, crazy rich Asians. They were, poor Asians, Chinese people coming here to look for gold. If they were crazy rich Asians, they would just stay in China. So we see that they have these hats that they would have worn in the fields to keep the sun off their shoulders and head, and by bringing them out into the rivers as they're looking for gold. They have this Q hairstyle, which is a symbol of Manchurian oppression. So basically, all the men, Han Chinese men, had to have this hairstyle, or else it would be seen as an act of rebellion against the Manchu government. And so either like have your hair this way or lose your head. And so early Chinese Americans were often lynched by their own hair, or it was chopped off so that they could never return back to their home. So the fact that it pops up in a lot of Nutcrackers seems kind of like a strange piece of history to keep reviving. So you can see the rise of caricature when Asians start to become a threat. And those depictions also translated into our ballets as well. So I'm so thankful for the archives at Ballet West. They've been so gracious in opening up this conversation and sharing their history and their evolution. So we start to see a rise of Yellowface, which is Asian caricature in classical ballet. So this is from the 1950s. This is in Willem Christensen's Nutcracker. We can see that they're actually quite detailed and quite ornate. So it doesn't mean they're not sort of beautiful in their own way, but it's really the mannerisms, the accentuation of the race really make this problematic in terms of the impact on actual Asian Americans. So, we have to keep in mind that a lot of these ballets were made for a certain audience. They're coming from Imperial Russia, where the audience is, the Tsar. And so now, as we're trying to get people of color into this art form, we've got to really think about how we're representing their cultures and who exactly do we want in the audience. So here we see this sort of, again, this fantasy China. You see the pagoda hat on the Chinese dancer. That would sort of be like if somebody had an Empire State Building hat and said that's an American person. It doesn't really look like a Chinese hat, but again, this fantasy, chinoiserie imagination. And then Adam Skloot, the current artistic director, took over and started to feel very uncomfortable with the Chinese caricature. So we see here, it's retained the same choreography, but it's really toned down the makeup. They almost look like Kazakh cultural dancers, not really Chinese. So it's, again, very stylized, non-specific, but then he still wanted to go a step further. And so this is their current version, which is inspired by a Peking opera warrior who battles a giant dragon that comes out, it's a giant puppet. And this was a way to actually represent something from authentic Chinese culture that felt respectful and also kind of a lot of fun. I would have wanted to dance this role. So again, if we want people of color to come into our spaces and feel welcome, yet we still present this outdated Eurocentric portrayal of their culture, those two things are not congruent. So we've really got to ask ourselves, what are we saving in the name of tradition, acknowledging that ballet changes all the time, in other areas. So why not when it comes to how we represent different races? So what is the actual impact on people of color who are starting to come in and break some ceilings? So wanted to introduce Gina, who can share her personal experience as a soloist in New York City Ballet.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for having me. So it's been a wild ride to be advocating for this diversity, but also be an active participant. My career is still very much ongoing at the New York City Ballet. When I first got into the company, I was 17, and I was not in a place where I realized that my otherness was influencing decisions. And I felt the otherness, and a lot of the critiques there were, and a lot of the critiques, they made it very much about my body, but just specifically comments about my makeup. Can you make your makeup look less Oriental was the word that was used. And it was only after many years I started to stand up for myself and say, you're asking me to adjust my makeup, but I have Asian features. And just by the idea of stage makeup is to accentuate your features so you can see them from the fourth ring. So in essence, I just look more Asian with my stage makeup on than I do sitting here. I wasn't able to piece these things together. And in my experience with the Nutcracker in particular, one of the first solo or featured roles, and it's really exciting to be cast as Chinese as a core dancer because you're on principal casting. And it's usually given to a smaller pair of women, and actually a smaller soloist or principal dancer. There's three dancers in the divertissement. It's a very, for the women, it's more of a, when I did the piece, I couldn't ever justify doing it straight. Just coming out and I immediately felt that something was wrong, but I couldn't voice at the age of 20. I couldn't say, no, I'm not going to do this part because it doesn't represent Asian culture, how I think it should be represented, how I feel. It's very hard in the power dynamic of being a ballerina or a dancer in the core, mind you. And I think I should make this clarification that as one grows in the company, if you're a soloist, especially if you're a principal, there's this idea of you are no longer a child, when in fact you could be a principal at the age of 20 and still essentially be a child. But you're given this sort of clout as a quote unquote adult. As a core person, it's only very recently that the dancers have used their agency to ask rehearsal directors to not refer to the group as the kids. So that gives you a little inside perspective of what it's like to be in just the large group of New York City Ballet. So doing this, one of the best stories I can tell is I had a great partner in crime. Her name was Stephanie Zungri, and we would just go out there. You push the box out, which first of all, you stuff a dancer into the box, into the tea box, because tea comes out of a box. Novel idea. We roll him out, and we have fans. We have our geisha wigs on, and our dress. And what's special about Chinese is that you dye your shoes yellow. And we are just kind of made fun of it. There was a whole bit with what would be chopsticks, but we had fans. So we just did this whole movement over the top. And then we would have balancing contests. We would, the choreography for the women is not so technical. The man is quite acrobatic. So we just I found myself making fun of the caricature. I made a caricature out of the character, and it got so much response from my fellow dancer castmates, is that they would all line up in the wings backstage to see, like, what are Stephanie and Gina going to do tonight? And it kept growing and growing and growing until the ballet mistress, our rehearsal director, Rosemary Dunleavy, came back and she said, "Oh, girls, you're doing a wonderful job, but no one's watching the principal man anymore." So that was when I didn't have the wherewithal at 2021, and I had done this divertisement for a while, and also continuing to grow as an adult and also grow as an artist. And it's only recently that I've been able to siphon it down as to why. It was the only way for me to deal with this uncomfortableness that I could not speak about. Now I'm, as a soloist and as just like a person, I feel empowered to speak my mind. And in fact, I might have a reputation in the company as being the dancer who will speak her mind. It's part of the reasons why I was asked to be on the diversity committee when I was not originally in the lineup of dancers that they had selected. I believe that the invitation from Peter is like, we would love you on the panel because we know you will tell us the truth. So that's my experience with coffee. With coffee, it's a different story. Coffee is the Arabian dance. This is something that you can, as Matthew mentioned, you can see me dance it, and it's my most recent portrayal, which was December in 2019. This is a complicated matter because she's a woman, and the saying is that Balanchine created the coffee dance as a respite for the fathers who were bored in the second act, who were, brought to the ballet. So she comes out, she is in this classic idea of like the midriff bra top, the head covering, but my belly is fully exposed and my legs are just bare. And how does one approach this without making it a trope? And so for me, as I was looking, and this is something that I always approached from, when I first debuted it at maybe like age 20 to now, and it's only been further and further distilled, is what is it about the choreography there? I believe that Balanchine based this dance off of belly dancing, but I didn't want the sensuality to be the first note of it. So the Arabian dance is 2 minutes long. It's much longer than a Chinese dance, and it's a solo. So I focused on the athleticism. There are many jumps. There's a musicality element where I have finger cymbals. I pride myself on being really articulate with the musicality. And that's a way that I take you out of the inherent sensuality of the moment, where I'm not just someone to look at, I'm also someone to watch dance in a real way. And as we continue to have these conversations, do I think that, New York City Ballet has done a wonderful job after the talk with Peter. He did make these changes, and he changed the Chinese divertissement, and we fixed the hat. Now he wears a very an imperial a hat that a regal person would wear. In the entrances, the 3 Chinese dancers don't have to shuffle out. They get to run on and do a normal ballet run on and bow instead of immediately be caricaturized from just the introduction. And in the finale, I think the biggest change is that the entire audience, when we redux back to the theme music, the entire audience used to make fingers and do choreography across the stage while the 3 dancers were dancing. That has now been changed to a very respectful ballet port-de-bras. And those are very simple changes, and still we are able to protect Balanchine's legacy. Phil and I are very much conservative in the sense that we are not trying to abolish what Balanchine has created, but we want to find ways to do simple change. And in thinking about coffee, I'm not sure if it's a matter of changing the costume. That's also not, that is not a decision for me to make. That is where the line is drawn. And speaking of agency, I feel like I have the power to, and I have the best practices that Phil and I have discovered to approach John Stafford and Wendy Whalen. John Stafford is the current artistic director of New York City Ballet, to say, hey, can we open up a discussion about this? Because this is how it's impacting me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one experiencing this. But ultimately, it will be his decision as the artistic director. Furthermore, in my personal experience, I think what Phil and I truly discovered is that there had not been a community, intercompany community of Asian and Asian American dancers. This past May, for Asian Pacific Heritage Month, we decided that we were going to do 30 interviews in 30 days. And it quickly became a huge endeavor. But we had a great time, and surprisingly, we ended up splitting it about 50-50. And the stories, the connections that we were able to make, there had never been a way for us to share our experiences with each other. And so what I realized, just as a Filipino American dancer, I had never been, like, I'd known Noelani at Pacific Northwest for, like, she had studied at Central Pennsylvania Youth Ballet, a different generation than but I also studied with the same teachers. So she has been someone who was like, I stand in her shadow. I stand on her shoulders. She has been here doing this, but yet we had never had a conversation until, May 19th of 2020. And to hear the things that she had experienced, some of the struggles, and then to hear the exact words that they told her about not, quote unquote, not fitting in, and then having it being having had the same exact words said to me, all of a sudden, I didn't feel alone anymore. I didn't feel like beyond Phil, I have no one else to kind of speak to this experience of being mixed race in the ballet world. And what a lovely and eye-opening experience that I think both Phil and I had in connecting with other people. And I think that's a great benefit to this work, is that it's not just Phil and I anymore. We have this group of like-minded people who have shared experience, and when we need help with Final Bow, we can call upon them to be like, our networks here are tapped out. Do you have new networks? And it's found a way to consolidate even more these conversations on a dancer level, not just the administrative side, which, Phil and I have been actively pursuing. Now the dancers are starting their own movements in their own companies and coming back and being like, what about this? And bouncing ideas off of us. And it's been such a wonderful process. And it was so worth all the stress of doing these 45-minute conversations, 2, 3, sometimes 5 a day. And then editing them, which Phil and I learned what eyeline is, we learned what lighting is, and all of this, this whole production. But I think that's it's created this zeitgeist, and finding agency within the power structure of ballet is not going to change. The artistic director is still, and one must respect the artistic director. But within it does not hurt or harm anyone. I feel like it only makes an artistic director better to have his dancers engaged in the conversation, and also speaking with other dancers and comparing notes on their own time in the work that they're doing on themselves. I think it's a win-win every way.
Matt, should I? All right, great. First, I just want to thank Phil and Georgina for their amazing work and these wonderful stories that they're sharing with us, and also Matt for inviting me to participate. And so he actually said that I should share a little bit of the story of how I ended up, or how I ended up agreeing while on sabbatical to be on this panel. And it was this amazing coincidence that I received Matt's email just a few weeks after I had watched pieces of the Nutcracker with my daughter. This was a really, I think like a couple decades old at this point. I think it was like the New York City Ballet production. And I had actually forgotten that there was Yellowface in the Nutcracker, but she's only 3, so we're watching snippets of it. And we just got to that and I just froze. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, okay, well, mommy's gonna just move us to the end, right? And we're just gonna see everybody doing their final dances and taking their bow. But it was an interesting problem because my daughter, as part of like one of her 2 pandemic passions were fire trucks and ballet. And the Nutcracker was particularly, like I still read the Nutcracker to her every night. And so just, I wanted to be a part of a conversation where we actually like think about this, right? And also just to be able to be here like in Zoom person to thank people who have been working on this issue, because I mean, now I get to take my daughter to the Nutcracker at some point in the future, and I'm not going to have to cover her eyes or take a bathroom break during the Chinese tea scene. What's interesting though, and before I kind of move into the more serious questions, is that the Nutcracker is such a cultural phenomenon that there is the dance, the ballet component of it. But even just purchasing a book on the Nutcracker, right? That you run up against, oh, there's the mysterious Arabian coffee dance. There's the kind of the jumping Chinese tea dance. And so there's a way in which, because it's so huge, because it's such a classic, it just permeates our culture in all these sort of different ways. And I do think that the kind of the work that the 2 of you have been doing, I'm hoping that it reaches all of those corners, right? That the next time I order the Nutcracker as a book, I'm not going to have to worry about also flipping the page and saying, okay, right, we're going to have to do some like cutting and pasting here. But what I really appreciate about the conversation thus far is that I think you're really highlighting just how detailed and nuanced the work is of bringing change about in the ballet world. I was just so fascinated by the idea that, when you're, right, the pledge that you actually ask people to sign is pretty straightforward. Do you mind if I actually read it out loud? I don't know. Okay. So the actual pledge is, I love ballet as an art form and acknowledge that to achieve diversity among our artists, audiences, donors, students, volunteers, and staff requires inclusion. I'm committed to eliminating outdated and offensive stereotypes of Asians, yellow face on our stages. And so what I love about it is it's very straightforward, but it's also actually completely open-ended, right? You're not saying, don't do the Chinese dance scene, or, we're stipulating these are the ways that you can kind of counteract what we're facing, what we're dealing with. And instead you're saying, commit to this, and then let's sort of figure out on the ground how we carry out this vision. And so, I was taking notes on, Phil, you're talking about this wonderful way in which you could go totally stylized with that dance, right? And kind of flatten it out so that it just seems vaguely cultural, but it really makes no real reference to anything. And again, it's so stylized that it's really hard to kind of actually pinpoint anything specific to it. Or you could go the total other direction and go completely authentic, right? Or authentic and really try to think hard about bringing in a whole other kind of cultural tradition and a kind of another kind of rarefied art form into that space, right? To make it a little bit more meaningful and significant. And then Georgina, you brought up like the possibility of making it completely ironic, right? Going up there and just like exaggerating it so much that it becomes caricature. And so I think it's just really wonderful that after you make the commitment, what you actually have are these opportunities to be playful, to be creative, right? To actually push the art forward. And so I think that if people are concerned about, are you shutting Balanchine down? Are you kind of restricting the art? I feel like the work you've done actually shows how, in fact, that kind of commitment to anti-racism, anti-yellowface is really about like kind of opening up, right? More, like about more possibilities, about more voices. So I really love that. Just as a kind of broad question to begin the discussion, one hesitation I had about agreeing to comment was that I don't have much knowledge about ballet or dance, that my work is primarily on race in American theater. And but Matt also sort of encouraged perhaps bringing a comparative view to this discussion. And so I was thinking a lot about ongoing debates, like really ongoing debates about Yellowface in drama and theater. More generally, and even thinking back to, a few decades ago, the really famous debate that occurred between Robert Brustein and August Wilson about, right, should the goal of theater be, American theater, be a kind of opening up of the roles, right, of the classic roles, the canonical roles, to people of color, to actors of color, so that we have, Arthur Miller's plays performed by, a cast that are all people of color? Or, as August Wilson argued, is it in fact time to actually produce different kinds of plays, right? To actually foreground the actual stories of, say, an African-American family, right? Instead of just sort of reproducing Miller all the time. And I know that ballet, at least in my general idea of it, is very different as a form, right? There is both a kind of, there is a kind of repertoire, right, of like the major ballets, like these are the ones that you really want to be in, these are the ones that people go to see. And there's also this like the amazing athleticism, right? Like the physical ability of the dancers is so important. In a way, it opens up the possibility for more people taking on those roles, even if there is a kind of misalignment, obvious, like between kind of obvious identifications. So it's easier in some ways to go to a ballet and say, like, wow, like these actors from all sorts of different backgrounds, they're all amazingly skilled dancers, and that's kind of what we want to go see, versus you could imagine someone going to a theater and being a little bit, less comfortable with, okay, well, that was like a white character. Why is like a person of color playing it, right? Even if they might feel uncomfortable expressing that. And so I'm really curious about where you see the possibilities for flexibility and change within ballet. And Phil, this is something that you've mentioned, like ballets always change. We can change it now. But especially for those who don't have as much background, right, and knowledge about that, what are the constraints, but also where are the spaces for further transformation?
So I think the biggest difference between theater and ballet is that there's always a text in theater. There's always a script. So there's this sort of safety harness for taking larger risks. So if you take a look at Shakespeare, for example, there have been so many versions of Midsummer Night's Dream, everything from the Jetsons to, feudal Japan to Under the Sea, and it's still The Tempest or, Midsummer Night's Dream, whatever. With ballet, it's a little harder because it's still very much an oral tradition. There is a notation, and a lot of it is stored at Harvard, but it's cumbersome, it's hard to read. Not everybody is well versed in reading it and interpreting it. Plus, there's also secrets to these ballets that are really, like, you just have to have done the role to know, okay, this is where you breathe. If you let go of your chest, he'll catch you and it'll be much easier to do this lift. It's those little things that you can't just write down, or if you breathe at this moment and look at the audience, that's going to break their heart. You just can't write that down. That comes from someone doing the role and passing it along like sourdough bread, to the next generation. So I think in that sense, ballet has been much more historically conservative and has this responsibility to keep things as is, just because the art form is disintegrating before our very eyes. Like every year we dust off the Nutcracker, like, there's always bits we need to fix, new people we need to put in, stuff we forgot what we did last year. So it's even harder if, say, the ballet hasn't come into repertory in 10 years or whatever. So there's a hesitation to really dream outside of the box in many of these cases. I'm currently working on a new version of Le Corsaire, for example. That's an Orientalist ballet. It's sort of a harem fantasy. And you go see Misty Copeland, who's the first African-American principal dancer, female principal ballerina at ABT, dancing the Happy Slave, at America's National Company. And you're like, that's our original sin of slavery. And like, how, how are we just all not thinking too hard about what we're putting on stage? Because remember, the original audience for this ballet was the Tsar, and the Tsar's dead. It's you and me in the audience now. We're the ones who are buying the tickets. We're the ones who are the donors. So what are we doing there? So yet, how do we keep this ballet, which is a real foundation of pushing the art form forward. So you really need to understand the classics, how they're constructed, the transition between the steps, the musicality, so that you can then push the art form forward and break those rules. So you really have to have that respect for history. It's important for dancers and choreographers to really get their hands dirty. It's not enough to just watch a video. You got to have it in your body. So how do we save that repertory and perform it, but make it relevant for audiences to today? So I'm working on a production of Le Corsaire with the brilliant Doug Fullington out of Pacific Northwest Ballet. He's a musicologist. He's a dance notation specialist. And we're actually going back to a lot of the old notations to reconstruct a lot of these steps that in many cases hasn't been seen in the United States even yet. But we're finding ways to keep the steps, but make it about us as Americans and not about them, those dopey Arabians over there. So this harem fantasy, which is Le Corsaire, based on the Lord Byron poem, we're staging it in another fantasy location at the Miss Ocean's Beauty Pageant at the Pirates Cove Casino in Atlantis Beach. And the owner of the casino is also the organizer of the beauty pageant. It's a role that's sort of the male sultan, Pasha. Our version will be played by a woman and travesty, so giving it a little playful twist, but still as a male character. And the Pasha is the type of guy who believes that you can touch women wherever you want without their permission, and owns the casino. So not anyone we know, not based in fact, but something that we can identify as like, oh, the joke's on us as Americans, these beauty pageants, this is our harem fantasy that we're still living today. And it's about us, it's not about them. So, and the beauty is you get to retain all of the classical steps, but instead of odalisques, they're dancing showgirls, same thing. So I think, that's the way that we need to keep these ballets alive, especially some of these ballets that are deemed racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, but still have a lot of value. So when Gina says that we take a conservative approach, we're not like Mark Morris, who's doing Hard Nut, which is taking the Tchaikovsky music, but his own interpretation of the choreography. It's not, Matthew Bourne, Swan Lake. It's actually the classical version, but we're just changing the setting a little bit.
And just to echo what Phil said, I think what's so wonderful about ballet is effervescent and it's ephemeral. And what's so interesting and hard about preserving ballet is that not only the dancers' bodies change from what was choreographed on me last fall. My body has completely changed since October 2019. And so there's a warping that's already happened, and I'm still firsthand. I'm still original cast. So that the ballet is already shifting according to what my body can do. So imagine all different casts of characters coming in. Balanchine was a fan of change. He changed roles according to the ballerina to make her look her best. And I think we've lost that a little bit in this vice grip we have to keep Balanchine's legacy, keep it intact. But I truly believe that Balanchine would have been all for what we were speaking of, to make it so that the audience, he created New York City Ballet to present the audience with an affordable ticket to see the ballet. That was one of his founding principles. And I think to if he were to sit here and hear this conversation, I feel like he would be open and receptive. Just like, Peter, after doing some work, he's open and receptive. John and Wendy are making this a priority for themselves. To answer your question, I also think that as much as we need to preserve the full lengths that we have, there is room in the art form for new full lengths. There is room for a feminine hero. There is room for a more than a one-dimensional depiction of what a prince is. There is so much that is untapped potential in the ballet world. We just need to put a little effort in to finding and telling these new stories. I think that it is so ripe with opportunity there.
If I could just run back real quick to something Julian said that I'd like to hear you all talk a bit about or address, was just from her remarks, you really got that palpable sense of relief that she feels that the quote unquote that the Chinese problem in the Nutcracker has been dealt with in a way. The issue has been raised, changes have been made. Um, why did this take so long to address? I mean, when I talk to a lot of people about this, that I get that same sense of like, oh, thank God this is gone. Phil reproduces quotes in his book from people and dancers that say, you know, I've been doing this for years. It's troubled me for years. This thing happened, and now I feel such a sense of fulfillment and relief that this has finally been, the issue has been raised. So, you know, I think at one point in the book, Phil calls it a serialized Yellowface, that the Nutcracker came back every year. And again, you know, why did it take till 2017? Phil does acknowledge some earlier efforts to kind of reform some of the roughest stereotypes that appeared, but it still seemed to have a life that was, you know, a pretty remarkable staying power. And so I just wonder if you could reflect on maybe what accounts for its persistence and its lack of sort of obvious objection through whatever period you want to say, 5, 10 years ago.
I don't think it's obvious, and I don't think it has been obvious for a lot of people. I think that we are, first of all, as artistic leaders, they're not necessarily trained to think like this. Choreographers often think like this. They have to be a little bit more analytical, but artistic directors are often former star dancers who maybe didn't necessarily go to college and don't have that academic curiosity in the same way. They feel like it's their job is to uphold the tradition and, you know, maintain this conservative, you know, curation of ballet. And so, yeah, I also think it's really easy to just not think too hard about it. Like, we did it last year. The sets and costumes are already paid for, or we have another 5 years to pay off these sets and costumes, so we got to use them. And also, it's just, you know, nobody spoke up last year. No one had a problem with it last year, so why would anyone have a problem with it this year? So I think that's the sort of outsider perspective. And as an insider, even when Gina and I first started doing this advocacy, there's this little voice in the back of our heads that's saying, maybe you're just making a big deal about nothing. You know, maybe you're being overly sensitive. Maybe you're being overly politically correct. Maybe it's just not such a big deal. And the flood of relief of parents saying, you know, a parent just last week wrote us and said, you know, during my daughter was an angel, and every time I go and pick her up during, you know, when she's done with doing angels, I have to sit there in the lobby and watch Chinese. And that was the exact moment every time, you know, 60 shows I'd walk in, and that's when I have to pick my daughter up, is while they're doing Chinese. And just like, I thought it would just never change, and I would just have to suck it up. And, you know, even though my daughter loves this art form, and so, and just what a relief that this is not the production that she'll get to dance the Sugar Plum in, you know, someday. So it shows Asian Americans that they have a place in this art form, that they belong, that they can see themselves in this space, and that they're able to come and relax and enjoy themselves just like everybody else. And that's really important if we want to practice inclusivity. You know, and I think that's, so from you know, both sides of why it hasn't really changed. You know, it's hard to be the only one who speaks up, because we all might feel something, but it's really hard to speak up when, you know, like Gina said, if you're, you know, this is your first big role, I can't talk to my director. There's a recent Yellowface controversy where a group of Asian dancers in a company that will not be named spoke up to their director and said, you know, we're not comfortable with this work. And the director said, well, that's, you know, that's really interesting, because I was considering you for The Prince and Swan Lake, but if you're going to be difficult with casting, then maybe you're not serious about being a dancer. You know, so there is that power dynamic that even if you do speak up, that you'll be punished for it. So yeah, there's a lot of factors that have just kept this, you know, the racial caricature from having a long shelf life. But I think as we get more people of color in leadership positions, in positions where they can actually speak up, and have creative input, we're going to start to see some major changes. So, you know, even like, how many Asian American choreographers have made major works for American ballet companies? Very few. probably you can name on one hand, if anybody can name any. So how do we, how do we do that? I know there's a few people who are listening who are dance aficionados who are already racking up that list. So we love to hear that. That's the energy we want. But most common people don't know that. They might know Christopher Wheeldon, but they might not know Chu Sang-go. And so the other side of the Yellowface coin, which sort of Gina and I's next endeavor is, fixing what's on stage in the Yellowface is just one side of the equation. The other side to keep ballet afloat is to actually provide a platform for authentic Asian voices to come in and have that contribution, to make new full lengths. And so we're talking to a few different partners about how do we launch an Asian choreographic incubator that specifically looks to build a pipeline of Asian talent, choreographic talent into the ballet world, so that we actually identify and nurture this next generation of young artists who actually will have something to say. I mean, they've all got something to say. They're already out there. So how do we connect them to the people that will hire them and give them an opportunity to share their talent and their voice? So I think that's the flip side of the Yellowface conversation, and that's sort of the larger what's next or what has to happen with this conversation.
I want to jump in and highlight something that Phil just said, and the fact that these dancers came, they spoke to their director, and their director had an unfortunate response in terms. I want to state that reprisal can take any form in the ballet world. It can be anything. And so it's very tricky to be a person of color and to be in the room and to be considered, where we are. I am biracial, so there's part of me that, my father raised me in a white trajectory. So I know that I pass and I'm in the room partly because of that. And I think there are other dancers specifically, you have the power dynamic, but then you also have the fact that at least I'm in the room. There are some dancers that aren't even in the room yet. And that's wild to speak up and advocate not only for oneself, but for everyone else too, because the conversation is intersectional.
Gina, I'll stick with you. And I was curious if you could say, just because it's come up now directly, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about your perspective as a dancer and what kind of agency you have as a dancer, in a typical company, let's say, vis-a-vis an artistic director, vis-a-vis choices about costume, makeup, et cetera. I mean, there does seem to be in a way in which, dancers are a vessel, and they don't seem to have a lot of agency in this process. At the same time, you're the ones performing the piece. And so I guess I'm wondering about that kind of ebb and flow. You've certainly suggested that as you advanced in your career, you've kind of grown into a different kind of dancer, a more assertive dancer. And so I'm just wondering if you could reflect generally on that, right? About how your career progressed, and then also, what would older you say to younger you? How would you react now to situations that you might have dealt with years ago, et cetera? Do you have any perspective you could offer on that? I think would be useful.
Yes, of course. Agency when it comes to dancers is a very new concept for dancers to wrap their heads around. It's even more mind-blowing for artistic administration. On the one hand, that the hierarchy of respect, there is one person. You got to think of it almost, for lack of a better comparison, you got to think of a ballet company as kind of like an oligarchy. There's one person that makes the decisions in artistic. Then you have the executive director. The dancers aren't necessarily in those conversations. And you make a great point that we are, for many, many years, we're just expected to show up, learn the choreography, dance it, be wonderfully beautiful on stage, period. That has never been enough for me as an artist. And I think it makes for better dancing and better expression when the dancers are asking the questions. And I will say it again, I think asking questions and doing it in a respectful way, not pointing fingers and not coming at the discussion in a defensive place, but an open place, an honest place, a place of vulnerability where you're like, if you do have a question, if little Gina was asking me for advice about the Chinese divertissement now, I would have her try to write down and articulate what exactly is making her feel uncomfortable and how that is impacting her as a person. And then I would encourage her to go to a ballet master and say, I'm not sure where I need to go to express this. And this is how this is making me feel. And I'm not sure if that is the intention here. And can you help me understand? And I think that is a way to talk about race and representation where it doesn't immediately shut down the conversation. If I were to go up to Peter and say, like, what you're doing is racist, it's going to shut down anyone. If you say, we have we're so polarized right now, just in general in our country, that if you say, well, you're wrong, it's the conversation's over. And so I would encourage dancers, especially now, and it's to reflect on it themselves and find a way to personalize it and say, this is impacting me this way. Help me understand how you see it, because I'm sure you're not intending to make me feel this way if I'm feeling bad. I want to share a story about the impact and the relief of, there was one letter, we have a write-in on our, you can sign the pledge and leave a comment. And there was one little girl, I think she was maybe 13, and she expressed her gratitude. She said, Phil, Gina, thank you so much for doing this. I saw myself in her. She says, I'm paraphrasing what she wrote, but she's like, I am a ballet dancer, and I am of a mixed heritage, and I have chosen not to go to School of American Ballet because I didn't think that they would cherish me. They wouldn't cherish my heritage. But seeing this work and knowing that there are people who are speaking for me and fighting for me, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to audition for School of American Ballet summer course this year, and I'm really, really excited. And that I remember talking to Phil, we both shed a tear. Like, that's the impact. I'm not doing this as someone who's still, speaking of agency and change and trying to answer your question, how it all feels. I'm not doing this work for me. This work, these seeds are being planted for future generations, because I don't want to have another. When I first came to the School of American Ballet, the pictures up on the wall were something that didn't depict anything that looks like me. And still, I feel that the choices that are made that I have no control over, they're like, at the end of the day, it's not a democratic process of whether or not I get to audition for a role. And that's different than, a Broadway sort of approach. There are no auditions at New York City Ballet. And I can only speak from my experience at New York City Ballet. I've not danced with any other company. It might be different, but there's not a process of audition in that sense where it's just open and democratic. I have been forthright and being like, is there a better way? And I think that's the question that I want to pose to everyone. And Phil and I keep coming back to about, like, what can change? How can this be different? It's just this, it's open-ended in the sense of, like, there's not one right way. And agency, I want to empower dancers to speak up for themselves. And I think there's also, as dancers, we need to look at the competitive nature of ballet and to not cut each other down. And I think that's also a new thought, especially women in ballet, because there's many more of us than there are men. I mean, like, it has changed. There are lots of men that dance, but in this term, women are usually pitted against other women. And I know that occurs in male dancing as well, but it can get very, very toxic especially in an environment where everyone wants to be the sugar plum fairy. No one gets into New York City Ballet to want to be like the maid in Nutcracker. Everyone wants to be the sugar plum. Everyone like it, but I also know myself. I'm not aiming to be a swan queen. That's not me, but I am a firebird. Like, and knowing oneself and trusting one's ability and being able to advocate for that, I think makes someone special. And that's an agency we can, as dancers, grasp hold of. And it still is respectful to the underlying idea that for now, we do not get to cast ourselves. It is still someone's subjective opinion. And until we come up with a better way, that's what it is. But it doesn't mean that you cannot advocate for yourself. I encourage it. And that's why Phil and I are here. We're here to help you articulate that, to spit it out once. I think that's part of the process. Sometimes you just need someone to spit it out, to hold my basket, let it all hang out, and then you can rephrase it in a way where you can have a actionable and constructive discussion.
This is sort of a question for everyone, but I'll start with you, Julian. Because it's something you've written about in your academic work, and that is the myth of the model minority. And I'm wondering if you can reflect a bit on how you think that particular stereotype sort of influences perceptions over, Asian American activism in the arts, and even the content of the art itself. Because I think effects are pernicious and sort of sometimes difficult to articulate. And I'm wondering if you can just start us down that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matt. I was thinking about this actually in hearing Georgina's response, one of her earlier accounts of kind of getting to the point of being able to speak out. Because I think part of the model minority myth is that Asian Americans aren't supposed to speak out. They're supposed to just kind of work hard within the system to get close to the top, right? Somewhat close to the top. And then that's the happy place for Asian Americans. But activism, speaking out, being angry, being upset, wanting to change the larger system, right? Not just our own fortunes, but the system at large. Like that is not what Asian Americans are about, right? Like that's essentially the myth. And so I do think that so much of this wonderful work is about, in many ways, countering that myth already by giving people a vehicle in which to express their frustration, right? And I think this goes back to many things that both of you said, allowing either through advice and coaching or through the medium of like this pledge, just having a structure ready for people who might want to push back a bit, right? And yet giving them a way that isn't necessarily going to like then immediately damage their careers, right? Or allowing them to do it in a way that feels kind of productive and that feels like a part of a community, right? So I do think that that the work you've crafted is really beautiful in giving kind of a form for an alternate way of kind of expressing kind of Asian American political viewpoints, but that's also entirely appropriate in some ways, like the genre that you're working with, like really understanding of like kind of the structure of ballet and what you kind of have to do with what you have to do within that world, like the deep understanding that you have to actually make change. And so I think that it's a really great model. But I would love to hear from Phil and Georgina as well, if they ever sense that like the initial kind of discomfort around it has to do in some ways with this idea that like Asian Americans like shouldn't be talking about this, that we should be happy enough to be on this stage in some form. I think as a sort of side comment, I'm really interested also in thinking about ballet as such a classic art form, and one that, at least for me, like ballet was associated very much with sound and with classical music. And of course, there's also kind of, there have been studies about this, right? There have been studies about the way that that classical music, that classical, like Western forms, have given like immigrants a kind of way to gain cultural capital, right? So that you have your kid play the piano instead of the guitar, because that seems to give you more cultural capital because it's associated with sort of like a high Western art form. And so I think ballet is really intriguing because it's so reified, and it seems like such an elite form. And so I think that I'd also love to hear your thoughts also about what it means specifically to be kind of breaking these barriers as Asian Americans within the ballet world. Like there's a way in which it makes sense for Asian Americans if we think about that kind of stereotype, right? Well, okay, of course, Asian Americans are going to be doing ballet and doing like piano and going to Juilliard, right? On the other hand, I think that there are obviously a lot of forces working against Asian Americans within the genre as well.
Yeah, so if we did our What's the Tea series, those 31 interviews in May, and what we found was the sort of most of the people that we talked to fell into two groups. One, they were either Asians from Asia who trained in an Asian majority environment and then got hired by an American company and moved to the United States, or they were biracial in some way and were able to just sort of pass, and weave their way through the system. And those are really the people who had been successful. This is, again, just our own, our own survey, not methodological, it's not a sociological study. But what that did show us, just based on that sort of realization, is that maybe our dance training system is creating Asian dancers as a pastime, but not necessarily professional Asian American dancers. I mean, obviously, Asians from Asia who come to the United States become Asian Americans. Of course, biracial Asian Americans are Asian Americans, but it's because they've sort of passed. And I think Gina and I are both biracial, so it's given us both the ability to pass, but also lived experiences of what it actually means to be Asian, in America today. So I think that's one thing that we found that was pretty interesting. And this other feeling was that there was, in some sense, shame or guilt in speaking up against any racist experiences that we had, because at least we're in the room, if not fully at the table. And look, there's a lot of darker people of color that aren't even in these companies. So at least we're in this space and getting a paycheck. So just keep your head down, work harder. That seems to be the Asian American way. And so I think because of that, there's also been less of a push for advocacy for Asian Americans to essentially rock the boat, because we have had some degree of acceptance, and the little scrap we've been thrown, maybe that's enough for now. But the larger issue is, if we do want to get more Asian people and we want crazy rich Asian money, to help support our art form, we got to do better. We got to do it all around better. It starts, looking at the marketing, looking at our training programs in our schools, looking at who we go after, how we ask for money, who is involved in the artistic process. All of those things need to be re-examined through this lens, and not just, okay, well, we have one Black principal ballerina and one Asian principal dancer, and diversity solved. Next up, we're doing La Baya Dare, so everyone's Indian this week. It doesn't work that way, And then Mrs. Singh, please, enroll your daughter and give us $10 million and join our board. It doesn't work that way, guys. So, and again, don't shoot the messenger. It's not us. We're just giving you, real truths, because, that Indian, your neighbors who are Indian, they can go take their students to Kathak dance down the street. They've got their own dance tradition. They don't need ballet. Yeah, you keep your Bayadere fantasy. I'm going to go get the real deal.
Speaking of fantasy, we only have about 5 minutes left. But one, probably the most oft-mentioned kind of rejoinder to the spirit of Final Bow for Yellowface that's appeared in the New York Times and other places is simply that a lot of ballets are kind of fantastic and fanciful, and make sort of light use of national stereotypes, etc. But could you just, in brief, sort of tell us, what's your response to someone that says that to you when you bring up
Yeah.
um,
I got that
something?
question. I got that question from a German magazine who said, it's just a costume, right? What's the big deal? It's a fantasy costume. And I said, okay, so let's imagine 1944 was America's first Nutcracker at San Francisco Ballet. And say instead of a Chinese dance, there was a German dance. And say we took what Germans looked like to Americans in 1944 and we put that on stage. And because it's tradition, we therefore can't change the choreography. So you're telling me in 2020, you still think the best representation of Germanness is goose-stepping Nazis? Get out of here.
Checkmate.
So as we do have to wrap up, I want to thank you all, but I do want to ask a final question. And it's really just that my perception is that, if we can call it, the Nutcracker campaign has been very, very successful in the sense that it's gotten a lot of publicity. There's been, tangible changes in productions across the country. You seem to have really found an effective pressure point. And so I'm wondering, moving forward, if there's other pressure points you've identified. Obviously, this is a larger campaign. It's about more than the Nutcracker. And, again, I'm just sort of impressed by the way you found that pressure point and the way you've been able to affect change so quickly. But also I'm curious about if there's other ideas you have or other pressure points you're targeting that you can see bringing about change, like, in the near term.
Yeah, I think the pressure points were really the artistic directors of America. It's really like 12 people who decide what the best practices for the entire field are. And so it's not like we had to call every dance studio in America and say, hey, your Nutcracker's a little outdated. Can you fix it, please? We literally just had to get 12 people on board in a public way to then have everybody start to say, oh, maybe we should do better. Other countries are now saying, oh, maybe we can do better. So that was a sort of, a judo technique where it was minimum force, just the right point to cause maximum, impact. Yeah, but like I said, this next phase is improving actual authentic Asians, replacing Orientalism and sort of these fantasies of Asia with real Asian voices. We're here in the audience, we're here in the community. Let us make room for us to tell our stories too. And you can still do Swan Lake and you can still do Giselle and Nutcracker. It still will happen every year. Those things are not going away. We're just asking you, like, if there's a street and it used to be just a freeway, you can also repurpose it so there's a car lane, a bike lane, and a pedestrian lane. Let's all share the road. There's room for everybody. So, anything to add, Gina?
I feel like in finding pressure points, we are encouraging people, and if they're interested in this work, is to, if they recognize a pressure point, to, like, we've laid out best practices for that, then they can do this work. It's like we want to create a platform in which it's not just Phil and I on a crusade. It's Phil and I laying the groundwork for everyone to start doing the change, everyone to jump on. This is a dance where everyone is invited. And so, and what we're doing now, we've got Mystery Nutcracker Theater. I'm going to make a selfless plug. We're not asking for money, but it is Giving Tuesday. We've got a we've got a really exciting way. We're exploring, like, talking about race with more humor, and all trying to get an outside world to understand how special the ballet world is, because this all comes from a place of love, where Phil and I, we are determined to bring ballet into this century and to keep it relevant for many, many years moving forward.
So the way we're doing it is we called Chinese Theater Works, which is a Chinese shadow puppet troupe here in New York City. And we got an old archival video of Ballet West's Nutcracker. And so what happens when two Chinese shadow puppets go to see this strange ethnic folk dance called the Nutcracker? So really examining it when you take out the European Eurocentric view of this ballet, what are we actually looking at, and how can we do it in a way that's playful and fun? And that's what's coming up next.
Okay, well, with that, we're right at 8:15. I hate to cut this off because I've really enjoyed this, and I know the audience has too, but I just want to thank all of our panelists again for tonight. I hope we can do this again. I do appreciate the call to arms at the end. Let's not make Gina and Phil do this all on their own. And, it's been really inspiring to hear about the project. I can't recommend the book highly enough. Check out the website, yellowface.org. And thank you all for coming this evening, and take care, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.